This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the British Light Mark IV tank, a tank of the interwar period, and for the Tank Museum it's actually now our oldest running track vehicle that we take out on a regular basis.
This video is dedicated to Pearson Engineering. We'd like to thank them for their support and for their help in ensuring the Vickers Light Mark IV, the oldest running historic tank in our collection, was able to take part in Tankfest 2023. Based at Newcastle upon Tyne in the old Vickers factory, Pearson Engineering continues to deliver manufacturing services to current armoured vehicle programmes, including the turret of the forthcoming Challenger 3.
Now, I'm going to take you back again, as ever. We just need to work out what's going on, what leads to this tank being built. And after the First World War, there's this big debate in certain military circles about what the future of the tank really is. And we've talked before on some of our other tank chats about that period in the 20s and 30s where lots of experimentation is done. Quite often, not large numbers of vehicles are actually made. Now, one of the people that's influential in Britain on this tank debate in the 1920s is a chap with a fantastic name. His name is Major Gifford Le Quesnay Martel, and he's a major in the Tank Corps. He's been influential at Tank Corps headquarters during the First World War, and he argues for the idea, why not make, and he actually makes one himself, a one-man tank. So you can build a lot of them and issue them to a large number of troops. And this becomes something called the Martel one-man tank. Now, other people take up on Martel's idea, and one of them, Sir John Carden, gets together with Vivian Lloyd, and they come up with, first of all, one-man and then two-man carriers. And we know these, we've looked at them before on tank chats, as tankets. Small vehicles, and the idea behind that is that you can build quite a number for not a particularly big budget, and quite a number of countries, not just Britain, likes this as an idea because they're cheap, and it means you can experiment, you can trial the use of armoured vehicles, even though these are only really very small items that originally their intention is for reconnaissance and maybe carrying a machine gun like a Vickers machine gun to places of operation. It can be fired from the vehicle or deposited, and it can tow other things, maybe like an anti-tank gun or supplies. Now, the Carden Lloyd carriers, actually over 300 of those are made for the British Army between about 1927 and 1935, and they have a utility and they have a use. They're used for reconnaissance on those experimental force exercises up on Salisbury Plain at the end of the 1920s. But at the same time, there's a realization they have vulnerabilities. And you only have to think of, when you see one of these, they're open-topped, airburst, even the crews inside, they've got very little protection. So the British military are thinking we still need that role, that reconnaissance role, to be carried out, but let's ask Vickers to design a vehicle that can be fully enclosed. Now, at the end of the 1920s, Vickers, who are the main British tank manufacturer, alongside Royal Ordnance, which is basically the government-owned tank factory based at Woolwich that's doing a number of other tasks there as well. But Vickers are the ones who are pushing the idea of different models of vehicles because they've got also a very good and thriving export market going as well. Now, Vickers come back with what becomes really the first light tank in British Army service, the Light Tank Mark I. It's given a straight six petrol engine that's put together by Meadows. It's called the EO6 engine, and it gives about 59 brake horsepower to the vehicle. It's got Horseman suspension on it. Now, they've tried this on these little carriers and these tankettes beforehand. Horseman suspension, what you're doing is you're getting a pair of wheels that are linked together by a casting, and then what's called a quarter elliptical leaf spring is actually attached to one of those castings, and it takes some of that pressure as the vehicle's bouncing along. The only trouble is, unfortunately, with Horseman suspension in the early days, it does tend to give a very springy ride to these vehicles. So you'll see them pitching and rolling all over the place. And part of that actually leads to crew fatigue because of this sicky-sick motion that you're in a lot of the time. And that, along with the engine, along with the levels of armour protection, that's what develops through this first series of light tanks that Vickers put together. Pretty much all of them are a work in progress, trying to come up with what ultimately we now know as a light 6B tank. That's the one that Britain ends up just before the war building the most of. Now, with that light first Mark I, they were going to put a Vickers machine gun in the turret. 4 of them are actually made, and one of those actually has a twin .5 over the heavy caliber Vickers machine gun on a twin mounting put on the top to act as an anti-aircraft role. So again, these are sent off to the mechanical warfare experimental establishment where they're actually trialled. They're looked at from the point of view, what else do we really want from these? They're too cramped. That's one of the first things that comes back that's pretty obvious for everybody. And this rough ride, they really think it needs some sort of extra work. Mark I's got about 14 millimetres of armour plate on the front, so not that thick armour, but again, probably enough to stop a bullet. They think that's probably all it's going to be needed to do. They like the idea of speed, so this engine, again, that Meadows engine is getting the vehicle up to about 35 miles an hour, and the overall vehicle is still pretty light. It's only just over about 3 tonnes, 3¼ tonnes. So 5 more of these Mark I vehicles are ordered at the end of 1930, and these ones are called the Mark 1A. This time they experiment with another engine in there, again part of this evolutionary process. They actually get a Ricardo diesel engine and try that in the vehicle. They change the sides, it's got slightly more sloping sides on the armour there, and 4 extra vehicles were also ordered to take out to India. And this is another one of these roles that the light tank has. They're thinking about empire, the colonial policing role. Actually, a light tank with tracks can get to places that the wheeled armoured cars can't. Think of India, Northwest Frontier. So again, there's a requirement there that sometimes we forget about in the 1930s because we see these vehicles, the tendency is to criticise them because of their performance in the early years of the Second World War. Well, actually, there's another role for them apart from just fighting on a main European battlefield. The ones that go to India, always a problem there, extra ventilation needed because of the heat, and quite often in India, any vehicle with a cupola, they like putting an extra area of protection for head cover for the commander of that vehicle. Now that Mark I, it's only a 2-man vehicle. Very quickly, by the end of the year, December 1930, we're moving straight on to the Mark II vehicle. 16 of those are ordered. They're showing some of the improvement. It's got a new oblong-shaped turret. It's got a space inside there that they're really looking for putting in a number 1 wireless set. If those wireless sets are available, they're still being made most of the time. So the commander has that at the back of the turret so he can operate that radio. 16 are made overall, 4 by Royal Ordnance, 12 by Vickers. And the idea here again is we're touching on a subject that becomes really important as the 1930s goes on. Who can actually build tanks? Now, Vickers is doing very well from the point of view with export orders as well. But again, as the 30s progress, the government and the War Office realised we're going to have to introduce more companies into building these tanks. And one of the issues that drives this Mark IV is making them simpler to build so more manufacturers, not just specialists like Vickers, can end up building them. Now, with the Mark II, they introduced for the first time something that we sometimes called CTA armour. It's actually called cemented tank armour, and it's not actually armour plates cemented together. It's actually face hardened. So they face harden one side of the armour plate, and they reckon that gives it about a 20% better protection against armour-piercing rounds. And so again, when you're talking about light tanks, the advantage there when you're putting CTA armour on a vehicle like the Mark II is it means that you can put less armour plate on for the same effect as normal armour plate. So again, they're trying to keep this weight down. The Mark II's got a Wilson pre-selected gearbox in it. 50 of these vehicles end up being made, and they're actually all issued out to the 3rd Battalion, the Tank Corps, who use them. It pretty much, that's it. There's no real spares there. Royal Ordnance have made about 29 of them. Vickers, 21 of them. These 50 vehicles are used quite extensively by the Tank Corps to trial the idea of light tanks. How are we going to actually use them in battle? Will they have a utility for flank guarding, for that earlier reconnaissance role, for taking machine guns to the positions they're really going to be needed? And as that progression, those testings, they also decide, hang on, let's try a different engine in it. And actually a Rolls-Royce 2025 engine is actually placed in some of these Mark IIs, and it replaces the earlier Meadows engine. The two companies that are building them, this Royal Ordnance again and Vickers, they're pretty much the same, but we end up calling one version the Mark IIA and Mark IIB, depending on the manufacturers. And if you're a real spotter, you can tell the difference because of where the fuel caps are on those particular vehicles. Again, going back to Empire, 50 of the Mark IIs are actually ordered for operations out in India. And they again show extra stowage, not that much differences, but an extra commander's cupola on the top there. Now, this progression that's going on as they're improving this light tank, each time that they're coming out with a new model, very quickly again, they're coming out with a new Mark III model. It has an upgraded version of the Horseman suspension on it. It's now got a Wilson pre-selected gearbox. It's got that Rolls-Royce engine put in right from the word go. It's got an enlarged turret on it. And they're trying to put together an alloy subframe to give it a bit more rigidity. And that's one of the things the guys here in the workshops, when they were looking at this one, when you take all the various panels and everything off, it's almost a vehicle that can flex because of the thin nature of most of the armour plate. So they try to give this a bit of a structure inside that they're actually either riveting or welding in some areas the armour plate to. Now that vehicle, not that many of those were made, 42 of them overall, and in 1935 some of these Mark III tanks are given out to the 6th Battalion's Tank Corps. Some of them go and see service out in the Middle East with the 6th Battalion as well. So again, it's going through this testing phase, which leads on, you'll be pleased to hear, to this tank, the Mark IV. So with the Mark IV, we've got a vehicle that's being built to try and again simplify the process. So it needs to be there for ease of maintenance, easy accessibility to things like the engine. And for the first time, they actually get rid of an idler wheel on the back of the vehicle. So we still have that Horseman suspension that you can see there, but it doesn't have an idler wheel. And that somehow makes the vehicle look a bit shorter and taller, even though in reality it actually isn't that much. Now, the turret on this vehicle, some people describe it as a squashed parallelogram. It's got about 12 millimeters of this CTA armour. The overall weight of the vehicle comes in about 4.3 tons, so the weight's going up. But to compensate, they're now back to another Meadows straight six petrol engine, but this one now has got about 90 horsepower. It's the same engine Meadows are building for Lagonda cars at the time. So when the restoration of this came along, we were actually using some of the Lagonda vintage car club, you know, for spare parts, etc., for being able to get R1 going again. This vehicle, it could keep up with that speed. It's still up to about 36 miles an hour, so that works quite well. 5-speed crash gearbox, clutch and brake steering. It's got, as you look at it from the front, slightly the turret's offset, and it's the last version of a light tank to be built only for 2-man crew. And still got that Vickers machine gun, still got the idea of the wireless in the turret, but as we've seen on other tank chats as well, if the commander is trying to operate the Vickers machine gun, command the vehicle, and operate the wireless set, they've got a lot on their plate. So the next version that comes out after the Mark IV, we're going up to now a 3-man crew with 2 men in the turret. As you look at this vehicle, again, they've got that angled armour plate on that CTA armour. On this as well, we're looking at here, not that thick of an armour. We're really trying to keep this simple still in the way that it's actually put together there. 28 of these vehicles are actually ordered, 14 from Vickers, 14 from Royal Ordnance, and that's not really enough. So you can see this is all work in progress. That won't even equip one whole battalion with the same tank. So we see these Mark IV vehicles are actually being issued in odd pairs, odd small groups to different units for this experimental purpose. Now, one of the things that comes back from the Mark IV, that shortening of the track, the pitching of this vehicle back and forward on that, still they're improving that Horseman suspension, but it still has a rocking motion. And the fact of that they actually give the commander these 2 hand grips on the side. And there's photos where they're training with these vehicles. And you can see that commander's holding on for dear life, because again, the way that vehicle, when it puts its brakes on, it really can pitch forward, and the last thing you want to be is launched out the top of that turret if you're the commander of one of these Mark IVs. So these vehicles, they do a version that goes out to India again. That's called the Mark IVA. They think about 29 of those are actually put together in 1934. And they extend the sides of the turret up to give that extra protection for the commander in the cupola. I think they're thinking there all the time in India, as we said before, it's about things like snipers taking pot shots at commanders. So they need a bit of extra protection if they're going to be looking out or trying to have that all-round visibility that's actually needed there. So a simpler design, but again, in the background, as this progression goes on, not that many of these tanks are being built, certainly compared to other countries in the 1930s. But part of that reason is quite simply, again, we go back to the basics, which is money and priorities. The War Office have been instructed by Parliament that actually the priorities are going to be the British Navy, Air Force and Air Defence of Britain, and tanks come last, as in the field army is not really considered that big a priority. It's really there as an emergency measure, number one, if there is a European war to defend Great Britain, and it's there as a police force for the empire. It is not necessarily thought of at this stage as going back to Europe as a main fighting expeditionary force. And that is given as a great example in 1933. So just the year before they put in the orders for these light Mark IVs, Lieutenant General Ronald Charles, he actually answers a question on this, and he says, the entire British tank production at that time in 1933 is 18 light tanks, each costing £1,500 each. That was it. It's only because of that threat of Italy and then Nazi Germany that British tank production starts winding up again, but it's not until 1936 that the government actually says to the army, you really start needing now, we are going to take the brakes off, we're going to give more money so that you can start building more fleets of vehicles and not just small fleets for testing like this Mark IV here. Now, Vickers, who have actually been building these tanks, this is a problem that's going on in the 30s. Vickers will take orders from the British War Office, which is absolutely great. Britain is seen, because of its role in the development of the tank in the First World War, as leading the world in the way of tanks into the late 1920s, early 1930s. So people were coming to Britain for things like those Cardinal Lloyd carriers, for the Vickers export tank that we all know about, goes to Russia, etc., the 5-tonner as it's sometimes called. So Vickers are very good that way, but that is subsidising in many ways the fact that there is a factory that can build tanks for the British Army and the British government. And Vickers only keep going because they are building tanks for so many countries. 34 to 36, when this one's being built, Vickers are actually doing orders for Belgium, for Holland, for Poland, for Switzerland, for China, Finland, India. You know, all over the place, people are coming to Vickers to buy, and that keeps the company going. The War Office keeps an eye on those exports. They can put a veto on if they don't like where the tanks are going, or they think the technology is too advanced to be sold elsewhere. War Office keeps an eye on that. But that is a problem, is one that a lot of NATO countries, of course, have got today in 2023, where, of course, how do you keep an arms industry going if there's not that many people elsewhere buying vehicles or buying munitions or guns, and then all of a sudden you're going to need them again? We have a war in Europe, same sort of problem. Britain looked at that problem with a view that these light tanks, like this Mark IV, goes on, not that many Mark Vs, Mark VI is a tank that they're going to build the most of. They actually use that tank as the vehicle that is going to be a testbed vehicle for new manufacturers. So we order a lot of light Mark VI tanks in Britain because we're really using that. Yes, they have a functional field use. Yes, they can help police with the empire, but they're also a great tank for new companies entering the defence market to build, so they learn they can cut their teeth on a relatively simple vehicle. Hence this desire for simplicity, not just maintenance, but also in manufacture. So more people in time of war can actually build more of them. Vickers, very professional, by the way, they ended up building their half of the Mark IV tanks that are built. They get those done within a year. They're there in 1935 for the manoeuvres that are taking place with the other side, which is Royal Ordnance, which is based at Woolwich, the official government factory. They are 15 months beyond that in their delivery of the Mark IV tanks that they make. And that's another problem that Royal Ordnance have got, again, this manufacturing, because of the priority. If all of a sudden the Navy comes to Royal Ordnance and says we need this, they tended to be given a priority over and above the tank manufacturer that way. 1936, Britain really starts to rearm. We start that process again. But I just thought, again, how that idea of why this was a bit late in the day, because we know that, again, Britain from 1936 to 1939, it actually makes about 1,462 tanks. And of those 1,462, only about 280 are cruisers or infantry tanks. The entire rest are light tanks, mainly Mark VI tanks. So that was because we were getting those tanks out to the factories, getting them going. Germany's already got going on their tank production. 2,481 tanks are built in that same period between 36 and the end of 1939. But again, even in Germany, 78% of those tanks built, 2,481, sorry, get my words mixed up, of those tanks, 78% of them are still Panzer Is and Panzer IIs. And again, on that one, actually 13 millimeters of armour plate, not that dissimilar to what we were putting on our light tanks at the time. The German Panzer I, Panzer II, some of them with only 2 machine guns. We had 1 Vickers machine gun on ours. So there's similarities there. The French have already got going on their tank program. They build, again, about double what the British are doing, 2,411 tanks, and that really does include some of those bigger Charbis, Samura, etc. tanks. So they are slightly ahead of us. That urgency that Britain has in the late 1930s is to try and catch up. And part and parcel, as I keep repeating, is finding companies that can actually make tanks like this Light Mark IV here, or actually its successor, the Light 6B. Now, our particular tank, the story behind this one, it came to us at the Tank Museum here from the School of Tank Technology. We think most of these Light Mark IVs, if they lasted 1 or 2 photographs at the beginning of the war, they're being used for training. The field army units are now using the improved version, which is that Light 6B. This one was gifted to the museum, School of Tank Technology, after the war. And I remember when I first came to the museum in 2000, this was sitting in one of the sheds looking very sorry for itself. I think at the end of the 1980s, it had gone off to Portsmouth. The Royal Navy unit had offered the opportunity of trying to restore it. Like with so many of these projects, they get a bit more complex than they first thought it was going to be. And so it was in a sort of semi-restored but rather derelict state. One other thing you can see on this Light Mark IV is the maker's plate. And I always find this interesting because they've made the effort during the Second World War. They realised if these vehicles are captured by the enemy, it basically says where they were made. Perfect indication where the German bombers should bomb. So someone's come along and chiselled off the Vickers of Newcastle actually embossed bit that's on that maker's plate there. So if this was a vehicle that had been sent to France or captured, you wouldn't have known where it had actually come from. Now, we're very lucky here at the Tank Museum. We had a benefactor who came forward and offered to pay for the restoration of this vehicle. So it went off a few years back to Armoured Engineering, where it was given a restoration. Lots of issues with it. Trying to get one of those Lagonda car engines, to supply spare parts, etc., for this Meadows engine, so that we could end up driving this vehicle again. And the restoration was done. It came back to the Tank Museum. We were able to show it off at one of our Tank Fest events. But those of you know about, if you're restoring any historic vehicle, this idea that you restore it and it comes to an end, as it were, the restoration, that's just fallacy. Restorations keep going. And recently we've been doing some more work on this vehicle, and it's really interesting because some of the companies that were out there, Horseman Suspension, who did the suspension on this particular vehicle, they're still going. They're one of their anniversaries this year. They're helping us here at the Tank Museum with some of our more modern suspension systems, so we were able to talk to them. And Pearson's Engineering, they came along and they were able to make us, before Tankfest this summer, some new drive sprockets, which was really necessary because our old ones that were on the vehicle are just simply wearing out. So they were able to make those for us. And interestingly, Pearson's is now as an engineering company based in the old Vickers factory up in Newcastle, where this vehicle was probably built back in the mid-1930s. So these connections still carry on that way. But as with all those companies that support us and manufacturers as well, we're really grateful because it means that this, for us here at the Tank Museum, this like Mark IV, bit of a rarity, a vehicle that didn't see an enormous amount of use with the British Army, but was part of that program of light tanks. It means it's our oldest track vehicle that we can run regularly. It was out at Tankfest this summer, driving around, and we hope, of course, there's no guarantees with this, it'll be a vehicle we can drive again with support from various people, including people like yourselves, well into the future.